Welcome to Civil Justice for SA Survivors.
Welcome back to Civil Justice for SA Survivors with attorneys Marc Pearlman and Melissa Anderson. Marc and Melissa represent survivors of SA or sexual assault and exploitation across Illinois, guiding them through the civil justice process with compassion and clarity. I'm Leanne Lyon, and today we're talking about the heavy weight of sexual abuse in Illinois. It's great to see you both.
It's good
Good to see you.
So we hear that survivors of childhood sex abuse often mourn the version of themselves that never got to exist. How do you help them process the grief of that stolen potential?
You know, it's a great question because perhaps the most difficult thing for survivors are the what ifs. What if this never happened to me? Would I still be the same person I am today? Would my education be different? Would I be a different kind of friend or partner in a relationship? So the what ifs are often haunt survivors. And, there's not very much about SA that you can normalize. But when it comes to the what ifs, those do exist in everyone's life. What if my parent wasn't so strict? What if, my teachers were better? So in that sense, we can normalize that aspect of it a little bit. But it is one of the most difficult things for our clients to deal with and kind of get their arms around.
So what is it like for a survivor to look at their own child reaching the age that they were when the abuse happened? How does that sometimes trigger a new wave of grief or protective fear?
Well, we found that oftentimes when a survivor's children or grandchildren become the age that they were when they were abused, what it triggers is them finally deciding that it's time for them to try to work through their trauma. And oftentimes that's when we get a phone call. And sadly, we're sometimes the first person they've ever told that they were abused. But they usually don't consciously realize that's why that was the trigger, the age of their children and their grandchildren. But we find that to be really common. I think they see for probably a combination of reasons. They see themselves in their children and grandchildren, and also they realize how vulnerable children are at that age. And it usually brings up a lot of emotion in them, which causes them to do something to try to deal with what happened to them for the first time.
The other thing that often occurs is when their children get to an age, or grandchildren or any loved one, um, when that child gets to the age that they were, it's very common for them to be very, very hyper protective. Not let your children have play dates, not let your children have sleepovers, things that children like to do. Um, so that's another, common thing that we see is the parenting becomes much more protective and they tend to isolate their children a little bit more.
Mhm. And what's interesting about that, oftentimes we'll ask if they think that the abuse impacted the way they parented their children, and they'll immediately say, "No, I don't think so." And then we come to learn they're the parent that coached every baseball team their kids were ever on, and they only allowed their children to have sleepovers at their house. Um, were very active in their children's lives to try to protect them, and it's interesting they don't usually put that connection together about how the abuse potentially impacted how they parent their own children.
Wow, that's fascinating, honestly. And as a parent, I can relate to other parents sometimes who acted in those ways when I would never put that together
Mhm.
for them either, not knowing their history.
Mhm.
Many survivors of childhood sex abuse describe moving through life with a heavy weight that they just can't name. In your experience talking with them, how does that weight change as they move from childhood into their 30s, their 40s, their 50s?
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that we experience all the time is when somebody finally comes forward and discloses that they were a victim or a survivor of SA, they feel an enormous weight lifted from them. And we can actually see a physical difference in their posture, just like they go from being, having their shoulders rolled forward to, they disclose. And through this process, they just, their shoulders are back. They are just much more communicative. So we see these changes, even though they don't necessarily see them in themselves. But
Mhm.
it's remarkable how just disclosing the fact that you were a victim of SA, how much that gives a release of bad energy, and just keeping secrets is really, really difficult on your mental health. That's just
Mhm.
a fact.
And, as it changes, how that weight changes, you asked through like 30s, 40s as they get older. A lot of our clients seem to think the more time that passes in between the abuse and as they get older, that things would get easier. And it's really that weight just keeps getting heavier and till finally they reach a point where they realize they're not, that weight's still just as heavy, if not worse, from having carried that secret. So it doesn't, the length of time that passes is really, it just gets harder and harder, usually not easier. And that's what usually prompts people to pick up the phone and call.
And we see that. We see when our clients come forward at a younger age, they are just much more likely to heal and understand the trauma and deal with it effectively, than when they're much older, 'cause it just gets more difficult with time.
For sure. It has to be some reward personally to see that, physically watch that change in your clients has to be very rewarding.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's
That moment you live for, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. When you say those moments, that is much more satisfying in connection with our work than any kind of monetary settlement we get for our clients. Seeing how they change, um, it's why we do what we do.
Yeah, and looking back in terms of cases, when I think back to our clients, I rarely remember how much their settlement was, but what I do remember is the transformation in which clients, hopefully everyone feels that they're in a better place at the end of this process than they were at the beginning. But I don't remember the amount of the settlement, but I certainly do remember the difference that they showed in the end of the process, and not because of the monetary award necessarily.
Right, for sure. And, it's just so complex. We know that the mind tries to forget, but the body often remembers through chronic pain or exhaustion or as the cycle of the year even goes by. What have survivors told you about when the moment that they realized that their physical health was actually a scream from the past?
Interestingly, very few of them make that connection at all. And I think that's probably true for all of us,
Mhm.
right? All of us, when we have a physical ailment, we don't necessarily connect something that happened to us that might have been traumatic that could be causing that, right? Well, thankfully, with mental health today and physical health, um, medical professionals understand the link between the physical and the mental. Um, but it's really, really important to understand that link and understand that your physical health is tremendously impacted by your physical health is tremendously impacted by your mental health.
Yeah, and the first time they even consider that there can be a connection is when we ask them, "Have you had a history of migraines or stomach aches, digestive problems, chronic pain?" And at first, they're wondering what that has to do with anything. And it, like anything else in the when they discover how they've been impacted, it brings them some peace having understanding around it, as to potentially why they've suffered through different things and that it might be linked to the trauma. So even putting that connection together can bring some relief.
And I think we mentioned this before, but it's noteworthy, particularly in light of what we're talking about today. There was a study done a long time ago in at Kaiser Permanente in California, but where they asked people whether they had ever been a victim of SA, or other really traumatic things. And those that were, when they answered the question that indicated that they had experienced severe trauma, um, those people that indicated they had were they sought 50% more medical treatment for physical ailments than the population that did not experience that trauma. Really interesting is that the following year, the people that said they were a victim of childhood trauma, by disclosing it the year previously, the following year, they sought a third less treatment for physical ailments than they did the year before, simply by acknowledging that it happened to them.
Wow, on a survey.
Yeah, this was it was part of a medical a, a, a medical study about the impact of adverse childhood, severe adverse childhood experiences, often referred to
Mm.
as ACEs. Um, and yeah, that was the so it was done by medical professionals
Right.
specifically to see what that data would look like.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
it
Really.
really is.
Well, you mentioned earlier that many survivors carry the secret, sometimes for decades. What does that internal isolation do to a person's sense of self worth as they try to build a normal life?
I, th- I think by just being in it alone and having to carry that secret alone just weighs on people in a way that it tends to impact sadly every aspect of their life. I mean, that's it. The weight of carrying something like that just permeates into everything, how you behave at work, how you behave in your relationships. And until what we found is until they actually disclose that secret, they don't and put the connection together as to how it might be impacting them, they really don't start to recover in all of those areas of their life. It's just a constant, like a hamster wheel they're on, not understanding why they can't get past certain things that seemingly aren't related to the trauma, why they can't be successful at certain things. And once they disclose that, that's sort of the key to helping them move forward.
And even making the connection, that's the biggest hurdle, is making the connection between some of the things that have happened to you in your life and the essay, because most people just attribute, this is who I am, my life is my life. Um, it is what it is. People are not sitting there, victims of essay are not sitting there going, when they have a bad day or they do something that's atypical, they don't sit there and go, oh, this is because of the essay I experienced 40 years ago. They just don't make that connection.
Well, kind of related, but many survivors become actually, instead of underachieving, they overachieve. They become perfectionists as a way to kind of outrun their past. How does that constant drive for success actually mask the heavy weight that they're carrying?
It masks it, I think sometimes to other people, but they're suffering just as tremendously as the people whose damages, are more apparent. You know, we have clients who say, well, this is what happened to me, but I haven't been impacted by it because I'm, the CEO of a company and I've got a happy marriage and I've got a happy children and I went to straight through school and was successful. That doesn't mean that they haven't been impacted. It just sometimes becomes a little bit more difficult to dig in and understand that throughout their life, they've still suffered just as badly, just because it's not as readily apparent on the surface. You know, they still have the interpersonal relationship issues. Sadly, a lot of still have a lot of self loathing and misplaced guilt in connection with what happened to them. But it just, once you just scratch the surface, you can see that those people who seemingly are so successful on the outside are still suffering just as badly on the inside and have been just as impacted by the trauma, just in different ways.
And it's interesting because avoidance, we all use avoidance as a means to deal with not having to deal with our our problems, our trauma, what have you. Um, but certainly being hyper vigilant, hyper focused on career success and things of that nature is preferable to addiction, to drugs or alcohol. But in fact, it's just a different kind of addiction. You're avoiding any, if you work really, really hard and you focus only on your work, you don't have to deal with intimacy issues with your spouse. You don't have to deal with a lot of the issues you may have with your children, with people in general. And when you're the boss, you also don't have to deal with authority figures because you are the authority figure. So they often have a lot of the same problems. They just manifest in different ways.
As we wrap up here today, finding peace can feel kind of like a foreign language after a time. So, how can you help somebody reimagine a future that isn't defined by what they survived, but by who they are choosing to become now?
It's a slow process when we see that happen, and we have a process where we don't sort of rush through, a case coming in and then immediately settling it. There's a lot that goes on in between, and y- I can see the clients redefining what their life is going to look like in a way that they had never imagined, because all of this energy and effort that's put into keeping their secret and avoiding, they've you watch them start to put their energy into other things, and they just have a new you can see the optimism there and the hope that they can do things differently going forward. It's a wonderful thing to see. And it's remarkable, somebody isn't necessarily healed, but they're certainly on the path to healing, and hopefully will continue to heal well past this. But you can see the physical change and how optimistic they become about the future, and are already starting to make those changes in relationships and in everything, most aspects of their life. You see little changes that they already start to make, and it's remarkable to watch.
And on that inspiring note, that is it for today's episode of Civil Justice for SA Survivors. If you'd like to know more about civil options for survivors in Illinois, you can visit pearlmananderson.com for additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. If this discussion helped you better understand your rights, please consider sharing it so that more survivors and families can find clear, trustworthy information. Thank you for joining me, Marc and Melissa.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.